It's been a slow start to the week for lawmakers, but it's expected to end with a bit more vigor.
You will see voter ID in committee this week or very early next week.
The proposed amendment was filed earlier this month and debate has been expected. But folks like the NAACP say they're not going to let a proposal to require folks to present a photo ID before voting be considered without them putting up a fight.
Just want them to know we want to put them on notice that we're up to their schemes, we're up to their wiles, and we're going to do all that we can to make sure that we expose them.
Meanwhile, legislative leaders say this is just one of several amendments they plan to move, including one on capping personal income tax, hunting and fishing rights, victims' rights, and one to define who oversees the State Board of Elections. A move that comes after a power struggle has played out in the courts between the legislature and the governor's office over who chooses its members.
Do you think the people of the state really want one person who will be a candidate for re-election, we assume in 2020, to be able to completely control the election process? That's what the governor's staff, the governor's attorneys, and its outside counsel.
The question that you know is going to come up as soon as you hear it, is this meant as a way to suppress some voters?
Not at all. In fact, states that have adopted voter identification laws have seen zero decrease in voter participation. In fact, most have seen an increase in voter participation. You know, when it comes to voter participation, it's generally dependent on what kind of cycle it is, what the turnout is. It has nothing to do with it.
The first committee in the legislative process for voter ID gaveled in Thursday morning. In a rare presentation by the Speaker of the House, he implored his colleagues to support the idea of photo identification at the polls.
You know, North Carolina is actually presently the last state, or rather the only state in the Southeast that has not adopted some form of voter ID already.
This is not a new idea for North Carolina. Attempts to get it into law began back in 2011, and a 2013 law, which would have required it, was later shot down by the court for targeting black voters. Opponents of this new effort say they believe this will do the same.
House Bill 1092 will forever harm eligible North Carolina voters, and those voters will disproportionately be people of color and the poor.
But supporters say they believe the addition to the Constitution would not have that effect.
This General Assembly would have to take into account what federal courts have ruled in the past, and would be wise to develop a model for voter ID that has passed federal muster.
Arguments in favor of photo identification include the belief it would stop voter fraud in the state. An effort was made in committee to therefore stretch that theory to absentee ballots, as well as in-person voting.
Make the law uniform in that if you need a photo ID to vote in person, you would also need it to vote absentee.
That was defeated, but along party lines, the measure was moved forward to consideration by the full House. Now, as this proposal is written, the exact type of photo identification that would be needed and the types of exceptions that would be made would be determined at a later date by the legislature. At the Legislative Building, Loretta Boniti, Spectrum News. So we had a Crime Victims' Rights Act back in the 90s. What's different about this?
Well, putting it in the Constitution will make it consistent across the state. So I represent a lot of victims of accidents. Sometimes that have a criminal element to them, like a drunk driver or things like that. You see in some counties like Wake County, they have a victim rights coordinator to do an excellent job of letting victims know the defendant has court date on this date. What do you want to see happen? Here's our proposed plea agreement. Do you wish to be heard?
We'll start with the personal income tax cap. Why is this something that's a good idea? And what if we go through a recession? Isn't there the concern about the state not having enough money?
Well, you know, our current Constitution provision on this limits the state income tax to 10%. This provision would limit it to 5.5%. I believe it's critical that we continue to lower our state income tax. It's been critical to our state's economic growth, And we want to make sure that going forward that the state income tax is limited to no more than that.
Well, as expected, lawmakers are trying to fit a lot into what is expected to be this last week of session. By week's end, they want to have 6 constitutional amendments approved by both of the chambers and on the ballot for voters. That was the bulk of the work that the State House did today. They took their final vote on the voter ID proposal, as well as 2 votes on the State Board of Elections and Ethics proposal. They're now both heading over to the Senate side. There was also a final vote taken on Marcy's Law. This is the Victims' Rights Bill, strengthening victims' rights within the state constitution. This is something that supporters say is necessary, but opponents wondered if this could put too much of a burden on the judicial system.
It tells you what we think ought to be done to make it safer for our victims in this state. And it applies to everyone, no matter how high or how low on the totem pole it might be.
With another constitutional amendment, we could be doing this by enhancing our statutes, which goes back to our current constitutional amendment on victims' rights.
As things stand right now with the constitutional amendments, all of the House proposals have been sent over to the Senate side. All of the Senate proposals have been sent over to the House side. So this process is moving along. Meanwhile, the state Senate also took time to take up some of the governor's vetoes that he sent back to the legislature. He sent 7 of them back. 2 of them originated on the Senate side, both the Farm Bill, which deals with nuisance lawsuits and redefining what milk is, as well as an early voting bill. Both of those bills were easily overridden on the Senate side. They're now heading over to the House side, as well as the 5 other bills that the governor vetoed. The House plans to take all of that up on Wednesday.